Psychoanalysis and Indian tradition. We continue our series. We completed Yoga Sutras and then we went into Brahmasutras. We completed the first part of Brahmasutras in our sessions 1 and 2. Today we'll get into the second part of Brahmasutra. It is titled Avirodha. We saw in the introductory session, Brahmasutra is divided into 4 parts. First is Samanvaya, harmonizing different Upanishads on the point of philosophical issues like Brahma, enlightenment, path to enlightenment. First part of Brahma Sutra was Samanvaya. Second is Avirodha, non-difference. Third is Sadhan, the process to reach the state of enlightenment or Brahma, or liberation, or freedom, or Kaivalya, or Nirvana. Fourth chapter relates to the Phala, the results. So the first relates to harmony. Second relates to overcoming the appearing differences between Upanishads and other spiritual texts. Within Upanishads and between Upanishads and other spiritual texts. Third is the process, the tools and techniques to go to the state of enlightenment. And fourth is the result of the effort, which is enlightenment. What is it all about? So this is how the text is structured. Before we go into the second chapter, Avirodha, to create a orientation, this chapter goes not so much into reconciliation as much into demolition of the opposition. And the demolition of opposition means anything that is not there in the Shrutis. Shrutis are the revealed scriptures, the Vedas and the Upanishads. And some of the Smritis like the Gita, which are not Aparushaya in the sense they are not suprahuman in their creation. Somebody in human form spoke Gita. Lord Krishna spoke Gita, but he was in the human form. So it is a Smriti, not a Shruti. It is not self-revealed. It is revealed through a human being that we know of. So the demolition of the opposition happens in 2 ways. One, by looking at Shrutis and some Smritis like the Gita as the gold standard, and using that as a gold standard, anything that does not conform to it is declared to be incorrect, which in my opinion is not a very strong way to refute an argument. Second refutation happens by using logic, where a contrary argument is analyzed and shown to be incorrect by virtue of its own logic, or to bring in a contrary logic from somewhere else where some argument seems to be better than this argument. Third way is by using analogy. And this to me is not a very convincing way, because types of analogies used in the Brahmasutras are not very profound. Some of them appear almost childish. So this is the way the refutation happens and the avirodha is established. Personally, I feel reading Brahmasutras that the profound depths which are necessary for reconciliation among all the Hindu spiritual scriptures by creating a more elemental, fundamental meta theory, those profound depths are missing. There is an occasional rise to the deepest heights in the Brahmasutras, but that rise is occasional. It always moves at a certain height, no doubt about it. But the deepest heights or the highest heights are not really the station for this work. It rises occasionally, but then it comes down to non-esoteric heights. The meta theory development is missing, which we find partly in Sankhya. That from defining elementals, you move on to creating a full theory based upon those elementals. That approach is missing in Brahmasutras. So here we find argumentation at a macro spiritual level, involving deep experiences, rare experiences, no doubt. But we don't find construction of the book involving elementals. Neither conceptual elementals nor empirical elementals. In that sense, it has been a slightly a personal disappointment when I heard first of Brahmasutra as something that is reconciling Upanishads and Shrutis and Smritis. I thought it would have a elemental theory of everything. In conceptual, essential sense, not in the comprehensive sense, but at least in the essential sense. That has not been there. My personal feeling is that if I am able to adequately work on the heat model of the mind and put it into this context and get something from the elemental theories of Sankhya, from the Jain philosophy, who also create a very good theory of elementals, and have certain conceptual elementals. Empirical elementals are far away, but conceptual elementals one can create to have a comprehensive meta theory which can reconcile the different seeming contradictions in the Shrutis and the Smritis. With this small introduction, let us get into the Brahmasutras line by line. Concerns of the Brahmasutra primarily are philosophical, and therefore only when there is an occasion I will get into a psychoanalytic commentary, not try to force fit a psychoanalytic commentary. The book starts the second chapter with opposition to Sankhya and Yoga Sutras. Both of them happen to be my favorites. I like them very much. Brahmasutras oppose both Sankhya and Yoga Sutras. And it's almost like from standpoint of Advaita Vedanta, it is fighting Sankhya and Yoga Sutras, which to me is not very pleasant, because I see Sankhya and Yoga Sutras as extremely precious, extremely valuable, loaded with truths. Partial truths, but still truths. And Yoga Sutras are so school agnostic, it's very difficult to oppose the Yoga Sutras, because Patanjali is so holistic, so open, and yet so school agnostic. But because Sankhya and Yoga Sutras don't seem to be completely in the camp of Advaita Vedanta, from where Vyasa seems to argue, Vyasa opposes both Sankhya and Yoga Sutras, which to me is not correct, because Sankhya and Yoga Sutras both are important, valuable texts and present to us very important paths of understanding oneself, reality, and moving to the enlightenment. I prefer pluralism, so I don't like this chapter of Avirodha, where the whole idea is demolition of Sankhya and Yoga Sutras. But this is what is there. And the argument taken up by Brahmasutra is this. Against Sankhya, it says, if Prakriti is inconscient, then inanimate can come out of animate, but animate can never come out of inanimate. And the animate and inanimate are both eternal. And this is inconsistent with the existence of animate. So this is the argument used, that consciousness cannot come out of inconscience. Second, the inconscient cannot obey laws unless some consciousness is put in there. And third, there would be a stalemate in the first condition, the pradhana, where all the gunas are equal. And therefore, the sattva, which is the matrix for intelligence, cannot operate because of tamas. And therefore, intelligent operations in the pradhana, the first state cannot happen, and therefore subsequent creation cannot happen. Sankhya almost would not agree with this, because there is no necessity that the tamas has to exactly cancel the sattva. There is also no necessity that Purusha cannot exist right from the start. But this is the opposition. The second opposition is when the pralay happens and everything is dissolved, is Brahma not contaminated by Prakriti? Because Prakriti then dissolves into Brahma. And the Brahma Sutra says no, nothing can contaminate Brahma, because it is Brahma which has converted itself into various things. And when anything converts into Brahma, it converts into a pure Brahma. With respect to the purpose of the existence, It says it is only in play. Brahma doesn't have any purpose except that it is in play. Why should it be in play, and why should that desire arise? Why should there be this boredom? Why this necessity of play? Why should the play be such a difficult play? Why should we have the problem of pain in God's world as a part of this play? On that, the Brahma Sutra, like any other text, is not able to give any convincing answer. Brahma Sutra also does not talk about the law of karma in terms of the first lodi. That when the Brahma converts into existence and creates elements and their characteristics and loads them with some karma. Similarly, creates consciousness and creates the nature of the self to begin with. And based upon it, the self chooses a journey, which itself is a kind of loading of karma. So every soul starts off with some initial loading in terms of its self nature. Why that happens and on what principles it happens? How can the evolution be accelerated? On those parts, Brahma Sutra doesn't have anything to say. Brahma Sutra again says Yoga Sutras create a duality, which I don't think is true. But the Brahma Sutra says it. It says emancipation is only possible by Veda and not by Yoga Sutra or Sankhya, which again I don't think is true. It talks about an emergent phenomena of Prakriti from Brahma. But how it happens, that is not gone into. How it can be stopped, if at all, it's not gone into. It also talks about the principle, one of the philosophical principles, which says that the principle of latency, pre-emergence, the principle says the effect is latent in the cause. So we don't have an emergent phenomena of the cause, rather we don't have the emergent phenomena of the effect, rather the effect is latent in the cause. And therefore, if we take this, then it leads to determinism. It also can lead, we don't know where to fit in free will. And then it will also be that if all effects are latent in the causes and all causes ultimately are in the first cause, then the creative power is exhausted in the beginning. A free will led, a chance led, a freedom led exercise of the creative power then becomes a problem by this canon. Second, it says effect returning to the cause can contaminate the cause. Which means the universe, having been created out of Brahma, if it goes back to the Brahma, can contaminate the Brahma. But then it says it is not possible. Brahma will always remain pure. So this effect returning to the cause can contaminate the cause is a argument of the opposite kind, which Brahma Sutra denies. It says the liberated cannot be dragged back into birth, because by the argument of the opposition, somebody liberated after the pralay, during the pralay, becomes one with the Brahma again and is dragged again into the next cycle into birth. But Brahmasutra says this is not so. It gives an example which I feel these are not very profound philosophical examples, very ordinary examples. But it says, just as a cobra is not affected by its poison, the Brahma is not affected by the Prakriti coming back in Pralay. And then it uses Shruti versus the logic of Kapila and Patanjali, the rishis Kapila and Patanjali. Kapila who wrote Sankhya, Patanjali who wrote Yoga Sutras. And by citing Shrutis, instead of giving logic, the refutation of Sankhya and Yoga Sutras is done. The Sankhya philosophy of Kapila and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. The refutation is done in the Brahma Sutra not by logic, but by just citing the authority of the Shruti, which to me doesn't seem to be a very strong way of dealing with Sankhya or Patanjali Yoga Sutras. I see them as very valuable, very rich, both Yoga Sutras and Sankhya. The idea should be to integrate them by a profound, deeper meta-psychological theory, metaphysical theory, instead of refuting in this way. It also refutes atomism. Brahma Sutra refutes atomism, where they say the nature is only built up of atoms, and the atoms are exclusive, non-overlapping entities, and elemental entities not created of more fundamental particles or more fundamental entities. And the argument again is given by some analogy. It talks about unmanifest Brahma, but stops short of the transcendent Brahma. It still is talking only about the universal Brahma. Part of the universal Brahma is manifest, part is unmanifest. And it says, because every event is there in the cause field of any event. If an event is an effect is contained in the cause. So if we look at the cause field of any event, it does not go into details of karma, chance, and laws. That kind of a multifactorial cause field for any event is not clearly given, which I think should be given. I have given it in the philosophy of the heat model of the mind. And Brahma, by the power of Maya, creates the existence. One good part about this chapter is on certain refutations are on merits without citing the Shrutis. So one is the Pradhana is inert, and therefore consciousness cannot come out of it. So therefore it refutes Sankhya on that point. I think there is some depth and substance in this, although I don't agree with it. Sankhya would not agree with it, but there is some profundity to this argument. Similarly, the Vaisheshika school, which talks about atomic reality, are refuted by the realists who are refuted by, they are the realists who are refuted by the argument that the consciousness you cannot explain by this atomic construction, and even the intelligence of the atom you cannot explain without some consciousness. Then the Brahma Sutra goes into Buddhists, the Shunyavadis, and the Kshanavadis, that everything is temporal and everything is going to be destroyed. And there they believe that the effect destroys the cause. They don't say the effect is not there in the cause, but the effect destroys the cause. Brahma Sutra says this is not true. The cause can remain independent of the effect. Even after the effect has actualized in reality, the cause need not be exhausted. And this seems to be more correct than the position of Shunyavadi, Akshanavadi, who say that the effect destroys the cause. The extreme idealists, the Sautantrikas, who say that matter exists only as a condition of the mind, are also refuted by Brahmasutras by saying the objective world exists independent of the perceiving subject, by referring to our everyday experience. That if 5 people are seeing something and one of them goes to sleep, the other 4 still continue to see reality as it is. Then the Pashupata school talks about God and matter as a duality, that both are existing forever, and matter does not need to come out of God. Both are equally primitive, equally primal. And Brahmasutra refutes it by saying that there cannot exist something without the first cause, and the first cause is God. So matter has to come out of God. Then the Madhyamika school, which says ideas too are unreal, like the Maya, and Shunya alone is real. So the Brahma Sutras opposites it by saying it is not the Shunya but the Brahma who is the real. The Buddhist constructionism is also refuted, and it says matter would be destitute of intelligence if there is no consciousness in matter. Matter would go destitute of intelligence, and therefore the existence of law that any matter obeys, and matter obeys laws, tells us that there is some intelligence and therefore consciousness in matter, and that consciousness cannot come out of matter. It has to come from somewhere else into matter. It does not go so far to say the matter itself comes out of consciousness. It does talk about matter coming out of Brahma, and Brahma having the character of Sat. So indirectly, implicitly, it does say that matter is involution of consciousness, but explicitly it does not say so. The Buddhist doctrine of cause existing only till effect, the temporality and ceaseless flux, they are refuted by Brahmasutra by saying even after the effect has taken place, the cause can continue to exist. And the Brahma is not exhausted because of creation of the universe. And this creates profound mathematical problems. Because when you talk about ceaseless flux, and you talk about you can never put your foot in the same water twice, then the problem of x equal to y comes about in mathematics. Because in reality, then there's nothing that corresponds to x equal to y. You can only have x tends to y. So the philosophical basis of anything that is any part of mathematics which tries to capture reality and uses equations with equal to, they get into question. Because in reality, then there is no x which is equal to y. You can only have x tends to y, but there's nothing in the universe where x is equal to y. X can only be equal to x, nothing else. One sect of the Buddhist school, the Udasins, the Vairagyavadis, those who are disappointed and resigned with the lure of the world, they are also opposed because sadhana needs a lot of energy and enthusiasm. By being dejected, disappointed, resigned, you cannot really do spiritual sadhana, spiritual effort. It requires a lot of energy and enthusiasm. Karmas and sanskars and historical records So it refutes temporality by saying our karmas, our memory, our life is a continuous process. We don't see it as temporary. We remember how we were in childhood, we remember how we are today, and we also experience a continuity. So while there is change, there is also continuity. The body changes, the thought changes, emotions changes, and yet you feel a continuity of existence, which is not dependent upon all this. So the non-temporality is as much a truth as temporality is. It also refutes the Jain philosophical positions that something may exist and may not exist at the same time. Now, this is more in congruence with modern quantum physics, but Brahmasutra does not agree with it. And this may relate to the fact that something may exist as a macro thing and may not exist at the micro level, or something may exist as a particle or a wave and may not exist as a particle or a wave at the same time, or something may exist at a place and not exist at a place at the same time. So the Jaina observation actually corresponds more to quantum mechanics than to the observation of Brahmasutras, but Brahmasutra rejects it. It says this is a logically inconsistent position, which is true in everyday terms, but at deeper, more fuzzy, esoteric levels of reality, the Jaina position seems to be more true. Whereas the macro terms, the Brahmasutra position seems to be more true. It also refutes Vasudeva as a supreme individual soul because of being a person, and Brahma is an impersonal entity. And it creates a difference that the soul is a part of Brahma, goes back to Brahma, but still it is not the supreme. There are limitations on the soul. There is no omnipotence for the soul, even for a liberated soul. Brahma Sutra then goes into Akasha. It says it is not something created, and this creates philosophical conundrums that Immanuel Kant talked about. So Brahma Sutra takes up the same argument that it's impossible to think about a pre-space and post-space. And it reads into Smrutis where nothing is said about Akasha. So this reading into business is not limited to the Supreme Court of India, which has turned this into a resourceful art. But it is there even in the Brahma Sutras, this reading into business. That when something is not written in the Shrutis, Brahma Sutra reads into it to say Akasha was not created. And this may have to do more with the thinking apparatus of the thinker rather than a fundamental feature of reality. What Immanuel Kant says is that space, time and causality are embedded in all thought. So it's very difficult to think about pre-space and post-space. Then it goes into the modeling problems, because how did the universe emerge? That model that Brahma started with X, then X became Y, Y became Z, Z led to ABC, they interacted between themselves, and finally the creation comes about. So from the Big Bang to the human history, or not the Big Bang in Brahmasutra terms, but the event of creation to human history. that modeling problems remain, they are not satisfactorily solved. So it goes into what is said in Mundakya Upanishad and Chandogya Upanishad and tries to reconcile them in terms of explaining the emergence of the universe without creating an elemental theory or a very clear structure of flow of events. But it does say, like Schopenhauer, that there is a will behind every event, but does not go into creating a full force field of how any event can be created, how any event comes to happen. That I have done in the heat model of the mind, the philosophy of it. What are the factors which lead to any event in general? So Brahmasutra does not give a full force field in generic terms behind every event or any event, but does say there is a divine will behind events. Then it goes into nature of consciousness, and it discusses Purusha, the intelligence of Purusha, the intelligence of soul when contact with the mind or otherwise also, and it says it disagrees with both Sankhya and Vaisheshika schools of thought, and the intelligence of soul always is with it even if the soul is not in contact with the mind. So it refutes the argument that the intelligence of the soul makes an advent only when the soul is in contact with the mind. It says, citing the Shruti, that the soul has intelligence by its own nature. It then talks about the soul and the skin, the soul, mind, body experience problem. That how the soul experiences. And therefore it comes to the point where the soul has to put forward certain entities for experiences. And that is explained much better by Sri Aurobindo than in Brahmasutras, which does not give elemental structural details about how the soul puts forward its agents within the human integer to enable experience, karma, and evolution. So that anatomy of the human integer is not given. Then there is a debate about the size of the soul. This I find slightly childish. Some talk about the soul being as big as the body, some talk about the size of the thumb, and all sorts of arguments are there. I find it childish the way this issue has been settled. The soul then, the Brahma Sutra says, has the ability to know, the desire to know, and knowledge is possible. And the soul needs also external entities for experience, the objective world for experience. And there is a freedom of the soul beyond good and evil, beyond bondage, there is liberation. And then it goes into soul and doership, that the soul can come to a point where there is no doership, no sense of doership. And the supreme is beyond good and evil. The soul is a part of the supreme, but not the supreme. And Sri Aurobindo talks about it very well, where he says the reality or God is immanent, but is not exhausted by the eminence that we see. There is a transcendent to our whole existence. And there can be many existences like the one we find ourselves situated in. Then it talks about pain going to God and how God is free from pain. Even if all the negative effects of the world merge back into God and come from God, God is free from all of them. And the soul is separate from God and it is one. It is one with God at the same time separate from God. Even when it merges back, it is still separate in one sense that it is not omnipotent. So the soul never becomes the supreme. So we see in this part, there is little that we can comment from a psychoanalytic standpoint. What is important from a psychoanalytic standpoint, which we can get into the philosophy of psychoanalysis, is these ideas of karma, sanskaras, and historical records, the akashic records. So when we say constitution, it can come out of karma and sanskaras, past life sanskaras. And when we say that after this life's trauma has been exhausted, you still have new traumas coming in, they may come from the historical records. In this theory of atomism, Vaisheshika, some of the Vaisheshika schools, we are reminded of Wittgenstein, a philosophical attempt at creating an atomic theory of existence. If not of existence, at least of logic, language, and human mind. So with this, we complete the second chapter. There isn't much to psychoanalytically comment upon. We'll take up the third chapter, fourth, and then we'll make a consolidated commentary if necessary to cover all the psychoanalytic aspects that we can talk about in the context of Brahmasutras. Thank you.